So the Germans are stopped at the Battle of the Marne. Paris is saved. France is saved from imminent defeat against the Germans. The Battle of the Marne actually marked one of the last battles in Western Europe until 1918 that was characterized by movement, by rapid movement. In the wake of the Battle of the Marne, what actually happened was what's known in history as the Race to the Sea. That is basically the Allies, the British and the French, and the Germans began to try and outflank one another. You can see here on the diagram, essentially trying to outflank one another as both armies moved north towards Dunkirk. And eventually, when neither side could fully outflank the other, they sat down, or the defences bogged down, and we moved to a stage of trench warfare. So we have the Battle of the Marne, the Race for the Sea, but by the fall of 1914, trench warfare has become the norm on the Western Front. The First World War and the movement of... Okay, we'll pause for a second. So trench warfare had become the norm, and actually what's notable is that even in the first half year of the First World War, between July and December 1914, 300,000 French casualties were suffered. So this conflict was even at the beginning, was on a scale that had not been seen before. One reason why French casualties remained high and actually would continue to grow into 1915 was the attitude of the French commander Joseph Joffre. He simply refused to acknowledge the fact that warfare had changed, and he insisted on the French army continuing to try to lead large charges against well-armed, well-defended positions. And the result essentially was slaughter for the French soldiers. In 1915, the French army basically suffers far higher casualty rates than their German counterparts, in part because Joffre's insistence on all-out assault, attacking armed German positions that were too easily defended, with little hope of breakthrough. And eventually in the war, that is going to have a consequence on the morale of the French army. So 1915, marked by steady warfare, trench warfare, high French casualties, and one person who believed we saw an opportunity to take advantage of these attitudes on the part of the French was a German general called Erich von Falkenhayn. So he was the German chief of staff from 1914 to 1916. And von Falkenhayn realized, he was one of the first commanders of the First World War to really fully understand that this defensive struggle, offense, is a bad idea, that it's going to be very difficult for any army to achieve a decisive military breakthrough through the trenches. And instead, von Falkenhayn decided to use the attitude of the French army and its commitment to repeated assaults to try and weaken France because of its own tactics. And so what von Falkenhayn actually decided to do was to target the French town of Verdun. His basic strategy was he wanted to try and bleed them white, that is the French, by attacking some area in the French defensive position that would force the French to commit high numbers of troops in the hopes that they could essentially decimate the French army. So von Falkenhayn was not necessarily particularly generous towards the attitudes of his own soldiers either. He basically had calculated, well, we will lose a lot of men in his plan to bleed France white, but the French will lose more, the French will struggle more to replace those men, and ultimately we'll win this war of attrition. So the target that von Falkenhayn chose was Verdun. Verdun has historically been, the fort at Verdun has historically been one of the key defensive positions in for the French military. Its strategic value in 1916, when von Falkenhayn decided to attack it, wasn't exceptionally high. But it had this historical kind of poignancy for French people that if Verdun fell, it would be a signal to the French that something was really going wrong with the war. So therefore, von Falkenhayn decided to attack Verdun starting in February 1916, in the correct belief, as it turns out, the French army would pour enormous resources into trying to prevent German capturing of Verdun, and that this would essentially be to the advantage of the Germans because the casualty rates suffered by the French in their kind of suicidal zeal to prevent Verdun from falling would be higher than the Germans. The two French commanders at Verdun were Philippe Pétain initially for the first few months of the war, and he was eventually replaced by Robert Nivelle. Both of them were determined that Verdun would not fall at any cost. Nivelle's famous cry, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, the enemy shall not pass, became a rallying cry initially at Verdun, but to this day still has a strong legacy in French society of determination to resist at all costs, that in the face of horrendous casualties, and the casualties at Verdun were horrendous, the spirit of the French would not be broken. And so for all the futility of the First World War, Verdun in particular holds a particularly significant place in the French psyche. Another reason for this was Pétain, when he was commander, understood that essentially the horrors that we faced at Verdun, the kind of constant, enormous barrages of artillery fire on both sides, hour after hour, day after day, that psychologically was very difficult for soldiers to cope with that over an extended period. So Pétain insisted on cycling defenders in and out of Verdun. And as a consequence, almost every French soldier who fought in the war in 1916 spent some time at Verdun. So it was also kind of a unifying moment amongst the various French soldiers. Long story short, von Falkenhayn's plan fails. The French manage to hold on to Verdun and are able to hold on to Verdun in a way that, while they suffer higher casualties, over time the gains the Germans are making in terms of fatalities to the French begin to fade out. Here we see the casualties on the part of the French and the Germans. So we're looking in the case of the Germans, 143,000 men killed between February and September 1916. The French at a higher rate, 163,000 men. But the consequence was that as time went on, these kind of the disparity in German and French casualties began to drop off, and the German high command realized that the von Falkenhayn's plan to bleed France dry had essentially failed. However, there were many people back in France who were still very, very critical of the attitude of the French military towards the war, of Joffre in particular, not just because of Joffre's military position, but also because under Joffre, to an extent, France became something of a military dictatorship, and that the civilian government bowed to the wishes of Joffre, kind of at his every whim and beck, and he was able to exert enormous control over French society during his period in charge of the French army. One of the staunchest critics of the French military effort, of Joffre in particular, was Georges Clemenceau. He was editor of a newspaper called The Freeman, L'Homme Libre, but starting in 1915 had begun a steady, regular beat of criticisms of Joffre in particular, of the French military in particular, of the French army or the French government in general. So much so, in fact, that Clemenceau was put in prison for a period of time. His newspaper was seized, and once he was able to get up and running printing again, he reproduced his newspaper. This time calls it L'Homme Enchaîné, the Man in Chains, and then so it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek critique of his own treatment at the part of the French government. Another aspect of French society that obviously was dramatically changed was the industrial output of France. Initially, the belief that the war would be short meant that essentially almost every able-bodied Frenchman was rushed off to the front. I think the figures are only 2% of eligible Frenchmen who were called up for duty did not show up. So most Frenchmen went forward to do their duty. But because France was expecting the war to be short, it simply had not built up the industrial capacities, had not built up the reserves of military goods, weapons, and things like that to sustain it for a long war. And so what was the result of this? One obvious result was that women were called into the workforce in greater numbers. Excuse me one second, there we go. Women were called into the factories in greater numbers, and many of them for the first time working in these large industrial factories producing weapons, as this picture shows here. Eventually, the French government also had to recall about 500,000 men trained in special skills that were needed back in the factories to return from the front because they were more useful for the French nation by their work back in the factories. And this meant that to make up this shortfall, France had to look to its empire in order to replace its I guess the manpower it had to send back to its factories. One of the most famous examples of French colonial troops who served during the war were the Tirailleurs Senegalese, that's the French or the Senegalese riflemen. They served in the French army during the war. I think the figures are about 200,000 West African troops fought for the French army during the First World War. Another about 100,000 soldiers from Indochina, that is modern Vietnam, modern Laos, also participated in the war. And at one stage, so while some of these men fought as soldiers, others worked as labourers, others worked in factories to make up the shortfall the French army was experiencing. And one of the most kind of astonishing figures from this period was that about 1/3 of all adult men in Algeria ended up serving in France during the war. So there was clearly this massive output or this massive contribution on the part of the empire to try and stem or try and help France in its hour of need. The person probably most singularly responsible for the organisation of the French state, especially meeting its war commitment, was Albert Thomas, who was appointed initially Under Secretary for Artillery and Munitions, eventually becoming full minister in that position. Thomas was a member of the Socialist Party, and so ideologically had always been committed to the idea that the French government could do more for the benefit of French society in general, from a socialist point of view. So he had very little difficulty in using the levers of government to seize control of French industry in order to redirect it towards the war effort. And under Thomas's guidance, the French did make some very impressive gains in terms of their capacity over time to produce military weapons, to produce the various goods that French society needed to sustain this long-term effort, this long-term war against the Germans. So while the French in some places weren't always as efficient as the British or Germans in terms of their industrial organisation, and this was largely a factor, or largely due to the fact that French factories still tend to be operated by small, medium-sized businesses as opposed to the large industrial conglomerates of Germany and Britain. But the French were able to produce substantive military and ammunition supplies to sustain them during the war. The bigger question, of course, was how is this all to be paid for? And the French government perhaps wasn't as innovative in terms of paying for the war. One of its solutions, as shown here in this graphic, was very simply printing more money to pay the workers. The French government was reluctant to tax the population any higher, so they printed more money. They continued to borrow from their allies, and over time the United States in particular became a big lender to France. And the belief simply was, well, we can kind of spend what we want because in the end, when the war is over, the Germans are going to pick up the tab. The famous expression in France was the Boche. The Boche, which is German or French for the blockheads, Germans. The Boche will pay. The Germans will be the one who will pick up the bill. And in that sense, the French, so the French war effort certainly wasn't financed in any kind of sustainable way, but it was carried forward in part because the belief was the Germans eventually would be the ones who would have to pay the bill.